Going to introduce my colleagues, some of whom will be giving us the presentation this morning. And immediately to my right, we have Dr. Benjamin Roberts, who is the Research Director in the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State Division at the HSRC. And then to his right, we have Professor Nania Bola Miller, who is the Divisional Executive of the Developmental, Capable and Ethical State Division at the Human Sciences Research Council. And then to the extreme right, we have Dr. Ngapeli Mkunu, who is the Senior Research Specialist, also within the DCS at the HSRC. So basically, we are going to take you through a presentation on the survey that was conducted on Election Day on the 29th of May 2024. And obviously, after the presentation, we will give you an opportunity to ask questions. So without wasting time, let me then give over to Dr. Ngapeli to start with the presentation. Thank you. Can we have the presentation on the screen, please? Thank you.
A very good morning. As Dr. Laki has already introduced me, my name is Ngapeli Mkunu, and I am a member of the Human Sciences Research Council's DCES division, part of the research team. So my job here is to provide an introduction and an overview of the research studies that we have been conducting over the years on behalf of the Electoral Commission as the Human Sciences Research Council. So one of the key measures of a strong election management body is its ability to make decisions that are based on empirical evidence. And this is something the Electoral Commission has attempted to do over the years. This dates back to the 1990s, where they have collaborated with the Human Sciences Research Council. This has been done mostly in two ways. The first one is the Voter Participation Survey, also known as the VPS. This study is a nationally representative survey which is embedded in the South African Social Attitude Survey infrastructure. It goes to field every pre-election year. So we did it in 2018, we did it in 2021, we did it in 2023, and we'll be doing it again in 2025 ahead of 2026 LGE. So far, we have got over 23,000 fully completed household representative surveys which were collected as part of this VPS study. We then have what we call the voter's voice. This is the election satisfaction survey. This particular survey takes place on election day across 300 voting stations across all 9 provinces in our country. Up to date, we have about 118,000, and when we checked the numbers in the morning, we had an additional 13,000 fully completed. So that takes the figure up to 130,000 fully completed interviews where the Human Sciences Research Council is able to measure and assess the voters' voice on election day across South Africa. So on the 29th, we went to our 7th national election. We also how the elections unfolded across the country, and the Human Sciences Research Council had a team of researchers all across the country. The purpose really of the survey is to ensure that we capture the views and opinions of voters. We all know that there will be observers, there will be key stakeholders, but one of the most important key stakeholders would be the voters who would have gone to cast their votes on election day. Some of the key questions we asked is whether or not citizens or participants felt that the elections were free and fair, amongst many other questions we asked, including, of course, many related to operations and general satisfaction with voting procedures. Now, from a methodological standpoint, I had already discussed that the ESS is through 300 voting stations across the country. These voting stations were sampled quite carefully, working together with a team of statisticians and other research methodology experts. The realization rate of Wednesday's survey stood at 88%, and our margin for error stood at less than 1%. With that, I'd like to call onto the podium my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Roberts. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to run through just a series of graphics speaking to some of the main findings coming from the election satisfaction survey of 24. This graph that's currently on the screen compares 2019 in the blue bars to 2024. It shows the distribution of interviews, those 13,155 that Ngapeli spoke to, and it shows the distribution across different time categories on election day. So you can see that 22% were done in the first few hours of election day, between 7 and 10:30. Another 30% were done between 10:30 and 2 o'clock. 34% were done between 2 and 5:30, and 14% were done between 5:30 and closure. Next slide. We asked them, when did you finally decide to vote in this national and provincial election? So we're again comparing 2019 to 24. 73% had made up their minds to participate more than 6 months prior to election day. 15% between 1 month and 6 months prior to election day, 6% in the last month, 2% in the last week, and 4% on election day itself. So the distributions haven't changed that much relative to 2019 and indeed some of the early elections that we've surveyed. We asked them, did the voting public, did any of the following reasons have a big influence on your decision to vote on election day? The dominant response from the voters was they voted because they still have an intrinsic belief that their vote makes a difference. 63% mentioned this as a response. This is a multiple response question, so they could answer for multiple choices. So the second, the runner-up was a sense of civic duty. So they said they voted because it's my responsibility to vote. So 43% of the voting public mentioned this as one of the key drivers of turnout. Other factors were related to more substantive issues such as trying to bring about economic improvement, to try and get good quality and reliable government services, particularly basic household services. Those were mentioned by close to 40%, as well as fighting against corruption. So a vote against corruption also mattered in election 24. Around a quarter mentioned to provide another party with a chance, as well as resonating with a particular leader or candidate. This is obviously a slide that is going to be particularly a source of some discussion, and that is how long did you queue before voting in this election? And here we've given a picture from 2009 national provincial election up to the current one. And you can see across successive elections from 2009 to 21, there was actually an improvement in queuing time. In 2024, there was a decline. And if you look at the dark green shaded bars, you'll see that relative to 2021, it dropped 70 percentage points in terms of queuing for 15 minutes or less. It's similar decline relative to the 2019 national and provincial election. In terms of those at the upper extreme, those who've queued for more than an hour, slightly over a tenth reported having to queue for longer than an hour. Just to say, we've looked at some of the provincial characteristics of that. Gauteng particularly had very much longer queuing times of over an hour. We'll come back a bit later to what effect has that queuing time had on electoral evaluation. So that comes towards the end, so we'll return to that point. We also asked about the ease with finding your party or candidate of choice on the ballot papers. So obviously, the ballot papers in 2024, we had the 3 ballot papers, but also on the ballot papers, an unprecedented number of parties and candidates contesting, particularly for the national one, which is for the first time had to have a double column of names of parties and candidates. So I think what we've seen is, in terms of the ease of finding the preferred candidate or party, that has declined slightly, not dramatically, but what's happened is we've seen the share reporting it as very easy, falling from 69 in 2019 to 61 in 2024. And it's swung more to somewhat easy, which has gone from 27 to 32. We're not seeing a big surge in those finding it difficult. It's more about the degree of ease rather than ease versus difficulty. We asked a subsequent set of questions about ballot papers and ballot paper improvements. We found that the vast majority were pleased with the ballot papers used at the voting stations. 58% said they were very satisfied with the ballot papers, and a further 35% said they were satisfied. Just over a third, at 38%, said that they wanted to improve the ballot paper see improvements for future elections. In terms of what the main suggestions were, 51% wanted to see improvements relating to the size of party logos. They felt they were somewhat small. A further 38% wanted improvements in terms of the numbers of parties and candidates on the ballot paper. They felt that there was a proliferation, and they found that level of choice somewhat overwhelming. 36% of those 36% also suggested improvements relating to the size of the party names, acronyms, and the candidates' names. So common finding is issues related to size of the features on the ballot papers. Next slide. Now we move to evaluations of electoral staff. We first off asked a general question: are you satisfied with the quality of service that IEC officials provided to voters? Again, we're looking at 2009 right through to 2024. In the latest election, 63% said that they were very satisfied with electoral staff, with a 31% saying they were very satisfied. So the dominant perspective is one of a positive response. In terms of trends over time, we've seen slight fluctuations, but not dramatic changes over the periods of the elections we've evaluated. Okay, next. We then moved on to more an evaluation of different attributes of electoral staff, and we asked about 7 particular characteristics ranging from honesty, professionalism, impartiality, etc. A clear majority of the voting public gave the officials a positive rating on all 7 of the indicators. The one that was most positive was the helpfulness of electoral staff, where 84% said that they were helpful to a great extent. The rate of the attributes that ranked the lowest, that was impartiality, with 71% saying that this applied to a great extent, with around 8% saying that the electoral staff were not at all impartial. Okay, next. Then we asked about to what extent the voting procedure inside the station considered the needs of special groups, and we asked about 5 particular groups in this case. Firstly, 54% said that they felt that the needs of women with babies was taken into account to a great extent, with 22% saying to some extent. A similar share saying pregnant women were considered at the voting station. And again, 57% for partially sighted and blind. Slightly higher shares said that persons with disabilities were taken into account, and the most positive evaluation was for older persons, the elderly. In terms of levels of information voters had about procedures, 61% thought the procedures inside the station were easy to understand, and 35% said they were somewhat easy. Around a tenth, at 13%, stated they had far too little information, and 10% said they had too little information about voting procedures. So there's still quite a lot of unmet demand for further information, which obviously the IEC can take account of in their future civic and democracy education events around the country. 42% of the voting public said the IEC website was very useful in providing information and education, with 23% saying it was somewhat useful. And in terms of the IEC voter education campaigns, 52% said of the voting public said it was very useful, and 28% somewhat useful. In terms of the perceived effectiveness of the IEC's voter education campaign, again, we're looking over time on this one, but in 2024, 66% said that they were very effective, 24% somewhat effective, with small shares saying they were either not effective or uncertain. Again, there's been a fairly constant evaluation we've seen from the voting public since 2009 across successive elections. Next. Then we asked about the secrecy of the vote. So are you satisfied that your vote in this voting station was secret? In 2024, 64% said they were very satisfied with this and 31% satisfied. There has been a slight decline in this, certainly relative to the 2009 through 2014 elections. The elections that have occurred since then, it's a bit lower, but it's been fairly stable from 2016 to 2024. We asked voters a set of questions related to self-reported coercion during the context of election 24. In this particular round of surveying, 12% reported experiencing someone trying to force them to vote for a certain political party or independent candidate. 9% reported that this happened before election day, and this, they said, was perpetrated 4% by party agents and 4% by friends and family as the dominant sources of this particular attempt to coerce voters. 4% occurred while they were queuing in lines, and again, the dominant responses were party agents at 2%, 1% friends and family, and 1% other voters. 2% said that some form of attempt at forcing them to change their vote happened inside the voting station, and the dominant responses here were, again, 1% party agents, 1% family and friends. Election officials were barely mentioned as a source of electoral coercion, less than 1% across all the different locations of attempted force. Of those that reported coercion, 73% reported that it had no bearing on who they ultimately chose to vote for on election day, but 25% said it did, and 2% were uncertain. So this translates, the 25% that said it did, translates into 3% of the voting public, which ultimately reported changing their vote due to some form of pressure. Okay, next one. So in terms of vote counting, we asked how confident are you that the vote will be accurately counted, and again comparing 2019 to 24. Here we've seen quite a drop in those saying that they're completely confident their vote will be accurately counted. It's dropped from 60% to 45%. Again, it hasn't swung to the negative end of the scale. It's a thinning out of completely confident and moving mainly into very or quite confident categories. But it does represent a substantive change relative to the last national and provincial election. Next. So now we move on to the evaluations of the freeness and fairness of elections, and we're again looking over time. In election 24, 92% said that the election procedures were unequivocally free, with small percent saying yes with minor problems and an even smaller percent not at all. Again, over the full period that we're looking at, they have remained in a very similar range between 90 and 95%. And a similar evaluation on fairness, perceived fairness of the election, 92% of the voting public indicated that the elections were unequivocally fair. We did ask them the reasons for this. Lucky, next slide. We asked an open-ended question about why they perceived the elections to be free and fair. We've coded those open-ended responses using Atlas TI. And what emerged was several key responses in the way the public viewed, predominated in their responses. One key response in viewpoint was that the elections were free and fair due to a prevailing sense that there was freedom to make political choices without any form of force, pressure, and intimidation. The open-ended data tends to demonstrate the freedom to make political choices remains fundamental in the minds of the voting public. There appears to be a critical construct that is influencing political participation, the sense of freedom of choice for elections amongst the public. It remains key that all stakeholders respect the values of political freedom to make political choices. Next. These have been coded into thematic concepts that inform judgments. So again, a high premium is placed amongst the public in their responses on the value of having the political space and being free from intimidation and to make their political choices as they see fit. The right to make political choices freely is a key value held by the South African voting public. The right to choose also links with fairness, and here participants tended to voice a view that fairness was found in having sufficient space and agency to make political choices when casting their votes. Again, the takeaway message is critically important for electoral integrity, that there's sufficient voice and agency for the voting public. This supports democratic legitimation and support for the electoral process as well as outcomes. We asked also, obviously, election 24, like preceding elections, has been a paper-based election. So we did ask one relating to a preference for paper-based versus electronic voting. So we asked voters, would you support or oppose replacing paper ballots with electronic voting machines at voting stations? We've analysed this by the time of day, but it was fairly invariant to the time of day. And what we found is that 29% strongly support moving to electronic voting. A further 22% support this. So just under, or around about half the public are in favour of moving to electronic voting. 10% were neutral, 21% opposed, and a further 15% strongly opposed. So there is a fair amount of polarisation around paper-based versus electronic ballots as the future of elections in South Africa. I'm returning now to the issue of queuing times. And what we were very keen in looking at is what bearing did this have on a range of the different evaluations we've shown in the preceding slides. I'm showing the ones on the screen now. It might be a bit small for those at the back of the room. I'm showing that the scale of effect that it had on a range of different aspects of election 24. So what we found is the longer you queued for, the less likely you were to be confident that your vote would be counted accurately. So for those that queued up to 15 minutes, 81% said that they were confident. That dropped to 63%, a difference of 18 percentage points based on queuing time. So for those that queued for 2 hours or more, there was a huge difference in views on confidence in the vote count. Support for electronic voting, interestingly here, for those that queued for longer, they had a greater appetite for switching to electronic voting. Perhaps they felt it might speed things up in the future. Evaluations of electoral staff also differed by about 14 percentage points. I think it should be stated, though, that while it's lower, it's still quite positive in evaluation. So for those that queued for 2 hours or more, 82% said they were satisfied with electoral staff, but it is lower than the 96% who had queued for less than 15 minutes or less. And we also did it for the list of attributes, and you can see it varies in a similar range of about 13 to 17 percentage points on most of those attributes. Trust in the Electoral Commission, that one varied by about 13 percentage points. So for those that queued less, 15 minutes or less, it stood at 87% voicing trust in the Commission. But it falls progressively as you queued for longer. And for those that queued for 2 hours or more, trust in the Commission drops to 74%. So again, still positive, but significantly less positive than those who queued for 15 minutes or less. In terms of perceived fairness of the election, there was a 10 percentage point variation on that one. The difference ranges between 83 for those who queued the longest, up to 93% for those who queued the least amount of time. Safety and security, there's a 7 percentage point difference, similar for perceived freeness of the election. And satisfaction with the ballot paper had the least amount of variation. The difference was between 89 and 94%. So really the queuing times did have an instrumental effect on assessments of election day, but it depends on the different aspect. But even those who queued the longest were positive in the main, but to a lesser degree. So in terms of concluding remarks, the Election Satisfaction Survey 24 assessed voters' views of the election process, including its integrity, and evaluated the operational efficiency of the Commission. It should be stated, though, and I think it's important to note, this was interviews amongst the voting public, those who'd actually got through and cast their ballot. Discouraged voters, those who gave up after queuing for long amounts of time, were not interviewed. So the discouraged voters are not included in the sample. So I think it's important just to state that. These are the views of those who actually waited, prevailed, and voted. The results indicated that voters overwhelmingly believed that 24 national and provincial elections were free and fair, and they positively rated the conduct of officials at the voting stations. Trust in the Commission was high, and almost all voters felt they were safe to cast their ballot in secrecy. The majority of voters felt that the Commission adequately considered the needs of vulnerable groups, particularly the elderly and persons with disabilities. But lastly, queuing times at voting stations increased relative to more recent elections, quite by a substantive degree, which really had a bearing on election attitudes. So we'll conclude there and pass back to Lucky for handling the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I will now open the floor for questions. If I could get questions specifically from media houses, journalists, that would be highly appreciated. I will start on the left. If I can get an indication of people who may want to ask questions on the left. I don't see any hands. I go to the middle. I see 2 hands, now 3. I will start with the gentleman in the red T-shirt.
My name is Norman Masungwini from City Press newspaper. The first question is relating to the issue of trust on the Electoral Commission to deliver the free and fair election. How much was that expressed by voters on the queue, considering the many glitches, which includes the element of your voter management devices and all the load shedding? And speaking of load shedding, was there any mention of such thing, and how much did it play on the voter turnout and the queuing for voters? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lady at the back.
Thank you very much. Kanima Panga from SABC News. You spoke about the translation of 3% of all voters who changed their vote when you spoke of coercion. If you look at the 2024 national and provincial elections and how crucial this election is, as well as how every vote counts, does this have any impact on that assessment? Then, of course, what I wanted to find out is more of an understanding as to when you pick that sample. So there's 300, and then you picked randomly selected 50 out of those 300 voting stations. A lot of people have a difficulty with understanding polls or these types of research as to how that will be representative of all these millions that have turned up to the polls. Please could you give us an understanding as to how how that representation, rather, is present when you sample in this manner? Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Yes.
Christian de Plessis from Netwerk24. I just have a question on the waiting times. Can this be taken to be a true reflection of the waiting times, considering that you didn't survey people who left the queues? Thank you.
I'm Itumeleng from The Citizen. I'd like to find out, could we compare the queues to those in 1994? Is it safe to say that they were just as long? And I'd like to ask about the electronic issue. So the people that have issues moving towards electronic voting, were they mostly in urban areas or rural areas? Thank you.
Okay, I see another hand here, so we'll do it this way. I think we've had about 4 questions already from the middle, and so we'll take the 5th one from the lady over there, and then in the next round we'll go to the right. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Simple. What is your take on the issue of people who were turned back and without being offered an opportunity to vote?
Sorry, can you stand up, please?
Okay, thank you. What is your take on the issue of people who were turned back without being offered an opportunity to vote on the national ballot paper, and then later there were people who were offered to vote on the national paper? Was it fair or something?
Thank you very much. Ben? Yeah.
Thank you very much for those questions. I'll start with the issue of trust. So trust in the Commission is actually, amongst the voting public, is very high. It's in the, well into the 80% range. I know your question was about the relative impact of VMDs, load shedding, etc. So that really doesn't come through that strongly in the data we've collected particularly. I think obviously it would come through in queuing time reports and obviously in this open-ended responses around freeness and fairness. So it's not coming out as a dominant response in what we've collected. I think some of the other surveys that are post-election surveys may capture some of that discontent. But it's certainly of the voting public, the trust in the Commission remains dominant. The other thing I want to state is Dr. Mchunu mentioned the 2 surveys we do. One is a pre-election survey, and one is which is of the whole voting age population, and the other one is the election day view experience, which is the views of just the voting public itself. In the amongst the general public, trust in the Commission has been declining, as it has in most core political institutions over the last decade and a half. Although the IEC does remain one of the most trusted institutions in the country. But obviously the voting public the trust is much higher. And that's probably for 2 dominant reasons. One is obviously the fact that many of the people we've interviewed have come out of the voting stations and had, generally speaking, perhaps leaving aside some aspects of the queuing time, a positive experience, and that translates into a positive evaluation of the Commission. The other one is that for many South Africans, the predominant response to unhappiness with the functioning of the political system is abstention. It's not electoral turnout. So we're finding increasing polarization between happier voters and the discontent abstainers. And that's what's probably driving those positive evaluations. On the one about, I think the SAB News question about those that reported changing their vote due to some pressure or force, I think it's, from a sort of every vote counts, it is concerning. Just to say, which we didn't put up, is it's been increasing over time, particularly since the 2016 elections. We've seen the reporting of, self-reporting of coercion increasing over time. It particularly jumped higher in 2019 and 2024. So it's something that we really have to watch out for. Just to say that it's happening predominantly before election day in households, in communities, that forms of pressure. But it is something that we do need to worry about because it is translating into 3% of change relative to what they might have voted for on election day. So it is something that we all, as concerned citizens, need to monitor and be wary of. In terms of, there was a question that SABC News also asked about methodology. So this is as Dr. Mchunu again in his introduction said, this is a random sample. So obviously of all the voting stations nationally, our statisticians randomly chose particular voting stations, taking into account provincial distribution of the